A rich CEO dumped his pregnant girlfriend. But years later, he found her living next door. Maximilian Worthington stood at the pinnacle of success, his every move scrutinized, his every decision weighed against the pressure of an empire built on ambition and ruthlessness. To the world, he was the epitome of what it meant to have it all: wealth, power, influence. Yet behind the polished exterior of his corporate persona was a man haunted by an unspoken fear: vulnerability. He'd spent years perfecting the mask that kept the world at bay, using his success as armor to shield himself from the emotional connection he so desperately avoided. His relationships, if they could even be called that, were fleeting, shallow, and transactional. No one had ever breached the walls he'd so carefully constructed around his heart, and he never allowed anyone close enough to try. Then came Isabella Moore. She was the opposite of everything Maximilian had built his life around. A talented artist whose empathy and warmth shone brightly, her very being a contrast to the coldness he had learned to embody. She was idealistic, passionate, and deeply in love with life. Isabella, for all her artistry and beauty, saw something in Maximilian that no one else had: the man behind the mask. She could feel the vulnerability beneath his cold demeanor, the person he tried so hard to hide. In her, Maximilian saw a reflection of everything he didn't know he needed. Her love was not just for who he appeared to be, but for who she believed he could become. It was this belief in him, this unspoken promise of something more, that drew him to her in ways he couldn't quite understand. Their whirlwind romance was like a painting brought to life, full of color, emotion, and a sense of freedom that neither of them had ever experienced before. Together, they felt invincible. Their chemistry was undeniable, a powerful force that eclipsed everything else in their lives. It was as though the world faded away when they were together, and in their eyes, there was only a shared future, one full of hope and potential. Yet, beneath the surface of their connection, there was a quiet tension that neither of them fully acknowledged: Maximilian's emotional distance. Despite the passion, despite the intensity of their love, Maximilian held something back, an invisible barrier that Isabella could never quite break down. When Isabella discovered she was pregnant, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one that would bind them forever. At first, the excitement overwhelmed her: a child, a future, a family. She imagined a world where they would raise their child together, where Maximilian would stand by her side, sharing the joys and challenges of parenthood. But the excitement quickly faded into a haze of fear and uncertainty as Maximilian's reaction was far from what she had hoped for. Rather than joy or anticipation, she saw only confusion, stress, and hesitation in his eyes. The realization that they were about to be parents seemed to strike him like a blow. He wasn't ready, wasn't sure he ever would be, and the weight of this impending responsibility began to sink in, deep into the pit of his stomach. Maximilian's internal struggle took root in his mind, torn between his fear of fatherhood and his obsession with maintaining control over his career. The very idea of adding a child into the equation threatened to unravel the carefully constructed life he had built. He wasn't sure how to reconcile this new reality with the world he had prioritized for so long: his power, his wealth, his position. Isabella, on the other hand, saw a future that included their child, where they would find a way to make it work together. She couldn't understand how Maximilian, the man she had fallen in love with, could choose career over family, could look at their unborn child and feel only fear instead of excitement. Her optimism clashed violently with his reluctance, and with each passing day, the emotional rift between them deepened. Maximilian's growing anxiety pushed him further into his work, leaving Isabella to face her pregnancy alone, without the support she desperately needed. The woman who had once seen him as her future now stood on the precipice of motherhood, fighting not just for their child, but for the relationship she had always believed was meant to last. With every hour Maximilian spent buried in his empire, Isabella began to feel more and more isolated, abandoned by the man she loved, unsure of how to navigate this unexpected, painful shift in their lives. As Maximilian withdrew further into his world of business and responsibility, Isabella found herself facing a future she had never imagined. The once vibrant dream of their life together now seemed impossible. Maximilian's emotional neglect became more pronounced, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. It wasn't just the absence of his affection, but the complete inability to communicate, to share in the weight of the impending parenthood, that cut through her. Every word he said was a reminder of his fear and uncertainty, a stark contrast to the certainty she felt in her love for him. The quiet moments, the simple exchanges that once meant everything, became strained, laden with unspoken thoughts and broken promises. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. An argument erupted, charged with emotions that neither of them knew how to control. Isabella, desperate for any sign that Maximilian cared, confronted him, but instead of understanding, she was met with cold detachment. Maximilian, unable to express his inner turmoil, retreated further into himself, choosing the safety of his career over the vulnerability of intimacy. It was in that moment, amidst the shouting and the hurt, that Isabella realized the truth. He wasn't going to change. Not for her, not for their child. The realization came as a brutal blow to her heart. Her world, once filled with hope, was now shattered by the man she had believed in, the man she had loved unconditionally. Maximilian made the decision to end their relationship with the same clinical detachment he had shown throughout their struggles. He explained, as though it were a business transaction, that he couldn't balance fatherhood with his empire, that his career would always come first. The words were like daggers to Isabella's heart, each one driving deeper the wound of betrayal. The love she had given him, the future they had once envisioned, were now gone, discarded in favor of his ambitions. She stood there, unable to fully process what had just happened, her emotions a tangled mess of disbelief, anger, and profound grief. Maximilian walked away, and with him, the last hope she had for their family. The aftermath of their breakup was suffocating for Isabella. Pregnant, alone, and heartbroken, she faced a new reality without the man who had once promised her everything. The weight of his abandonment pressed heavily on her chest as she navigated the lonely days ahead. She knew that for the sake of their child, she had to keep going. She had to survive. And so, she made the painful decision to cut ties with Maximilian, to let go of the man she once loved and protect herself from the devastation of his absence. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the only way forward. She could not afford to keep holding on to a love that had already been taken from her. In the months that followed, Isabella withdrew from everything that had once been a part of her life. She distanced herself from friends, family, and anyone who reminded her of the pain Maximilian had caused. She needed space, time to heal, to focus on the child growing inside her, to figure out who she was without him. It was in this solitude that she rediscovered her art. The canvas became her sanctuary, a place where she could pour out her anger, her sorrow, and the deep, unhealed parts of herself. Through her art, Isabella began to reclaim her strength, to rebuild her identity without the shadow of Maximilian hanging over her. She wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned. She was a mother, an artist, a woman who would rise again. As her pregnancy progressed, Isabella faced each day with a quiet determination. Though the pain of losing Maximilian would never fully dissipate, she found a sense of peace in her new reality. She knew that she had made the right decision, that raising her child alone was the only way to protect her heart. And yet, even in her solitude, she couldn't shake the bittersweet feeling that lingered. The remnants of the life she had once imagined, the family that could have been. But she had survived, and as she looked ahead, with the knowledge that she would raise her child on her own terms, she realized that she was stronger than she had ever believed. The pain of loss would never disappear, but it no longer defined her. Maximilian buried himself in work as a way to escape the emotional devastation that had followed him in the years after his decision to leave Isabella behind. His corporate empire became both a fortress and a prison, sheltering him from the painful memories of his past, but also creating a solitude that grew more suffocating with each passing day. The pressure of running a vast business only intensified his obsession with power and success, driving him to climb higher up the corporate ladder, never stopping to acknowledge the emotional cost of his ambition. The accolades, the financial triumphs, and the material wealth became his only solace, though they did little to fill the deep emptiness that gnawed at his soul. Beneath the surface of his polished exterior, a quiet storm of regret and self-loathing brewed, though Maximilian never allowed himself to fully face it. Success, he thought, could fill the void if only he could acquire enough of it. But no matter how many deals he brokered, no matter how many zeros were added to his bank account, the emptiness remained unshakable and unforgiving. In the solitude of his office, surrounded by business partners and yes-men, Maximilian realized just how alone he had become. Colleagues came and went, some praising his intellect, others eager to use him for their own gain, but none could replace the connections he had once had, especially the one with Isabella. He had isolated himself from everything that had once mattered, burying his feelings under layers of corporate responsibility. Even as the world admired his success, Maximilian found himself more distant from the very essence of living: love, companionship, and emotional fulfillment. His closest relationships, built on transactional interactions, felt hollow, no more substantial than the business deals he sealed daily. He surrounded himself with sycophants who praised his accomplishments, but their praise never reached him, never touched the empty spaces inside him that had once been filled with genuine affection and connection. His greatest fear, being vulnerable, had led him to build walls so high that he couldn't see past them, and now, in the silence of his loneliness, he regretted it. In moments of quiet, when the weight of his achievements pressed too heavily on his chest, Maximilian was haunted by fleeting glimpses of his past. A photo of Isabella, a song they had once danced to, the smell of a place they had visited together. It was as if they were all fragments of a life he could never reclaim. He pushed these reminders away, burying them under layers of work, but they never fully disappeared. The guilt of abandoning her, the shame of choosing his career over the family they could have had, seeped through the cracks of his carefully constructed armor. But the fear of confronting these emotions kept him at bay, and instead, he pushed them deeper into his subconscious, where they festered, growing stronger with each passing year. Maximilian, for all his accomplishments, was still running from the truth, running from the life he had once loved, running from the consequences of his own actions. Meanwhile, Isabella's life had transformed in ways Maximilian could never have predicted. Time had not only healed her wounds, it had strengthened her. The heartbreak of losing him had ignited a fire within her, one that fueled her artistic career and allowed her to rebuild a life from the ashes of her past. Her art had become a reflection of her journey, an emotional exploration of pain, hope, and resilience. It spoke to those who saw her work, touching them in ways words never could. Isabella's success was hard-earned, built through years of self-discovery and healing. She had become an independent, empowered woman, someone who had found peace within herself despite the heavy burden of her past. What once felt like an unbearable weight was now a source of strength, a story of survival that she could share with the world. Isabella's love for Noah had become the foundation of her new life. Her son, growing up without the presence of his father, had blossomed into a kind, perceptive young boy. They shared a bond that was unbreakable, forged through the years of sacrifice, love, and understanding. Isabella had given him the life she had always dreamed of, a life free from the pain of Maximilian's abandonment. Noah knew little about his father, and Isabella had made the choice not to burden him with the past. She wanted him to see the world with his own eyes, to grow up surrounded by love and support. She gave him everything she could, her heart, her soul, and all the emotional depth that Maximilian had once shared with her, now redirected toward her son. Though she had found a semblance of peace, Isabella was not untouched by the scars of her past. The pain of losing Maximilian was a wound that never fully healed, but through her art, she had learned to live with it. The canvas had become her therapy, a way for her to express the emotions she could not voice. Her work evolved as she did, from the raw expressions of grief to the more introspective pieces that captured her growth. Isabella no longer viewed herself as a victim of her circumstances. She was a woman who had taken control of her own destiny. But even as she embraced her success, a part of her still carried the weight of what could have been, a life that could have been hers had Maximilian not walked away. The years passed, and Maximilian's internal struggle continued. Though he had everything anyone could want, money, status, power, there was a deep, gnawing emptiness that he could not escape. He yearned for something he couldn't put into words. There was no one to share his triumphs with, no one to revel in the success he had fought so hard to achieve. His wealth, his power, his empire, they felt like hollow victories when he realized he had no one to experience them with. He had built this life, but it was a life without meaning, without love, without connection. Maximilian had never understood before how much he needed those things, how much he had taken them for granted until they were gone. And then everything changed. A chance encounter, one he never saw coming, brought him face to face with someone from his past. The moment they met again, it felt like the universe had shifted. It stirred up emotions Maximilian had long buried, forcing him to confront the choices he had made, the mistakes he had spent years avoiding. It was a meeting that would set him on a path he could not turn away from, a path toward redemption, though he didn't yet know how or if it was even possible. As the days passed after the encounter, Maximilian found himself consumed by the realization of what he had lost. The weight of his mistakes pressed on him, no longer something he could push aside. The images of Isabella and Noah haunted his thoughts with a clarity that he could no longer ignore. His feelings of regret intensified, and for the first time in years, he truly understood the magnitude of his actions. The hollow victories, the empty boardrooms, the material wealth, it all seemed insignificant now, like fleeting distractions that had kept him from facing the truth. Maximilian's heart ached as he thought of the family he had abandoned, of the love he had thrown away in pursuit of power. He had been so blinded by his ambition that he had failed to see the value of what he already had. The dream of a life with Isabella, the vision of a family, had slipped away from him, and he could no longer pretend that his wealth and status could fill the void left by their absence. The more Maximilian reflected on his choices, the more the emotional weight of his decisions became unbearable. He could no longer hide from the reality of his actions. He had chosen his career over the woman he loved, over the family they could have built together. And in doing so, he had forfeited not only his chance at happiness, but also the possibility of ever being the man he wanted to be. The remorse was overwhelming, suffocating him in its intensity. The truth of his loss struck him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in its fury. He had cast aside everything that truly mattered, and now he was left with nothing but regret. Maximilian knew that there was no way to reverse time, no way to undo the damage he had caused. But he also knew that if he was ever to find peace, if he was ever to make amends for the pain he had caused, he had to confront the past head-on. He couldn't keep running from it. He couldn't keep hiding behind his success. The road to redemption would not be easy, but it was the only path that could lead him back to the man he once aspired to be. Determined to make things right, Maximilian began to take the first steps toward rebuilding his life. He knew that it wouldn't be enough to simply apologize. Words alone could never undo the damage he had inflicted. He would need to show Isabella and himself that he had changed. The fear of rejection gnawed at him, and the thought of being turned away by the one person he had wronged the most was terrifying. But it was a fear he had to face. There was no other choice. He had to try, or else he would be condemned to live the rest of his life with the haunting knowledge that he had let his chance at redemption slip away. Maximilian reached out to Isabella, his heart pounding with the uncertainty of what might come next. He didn't expect forgiveness, not right away, and perhaps not ever. But he needed her to know that he had seen the error of his ways, that he understood the depth of the hurt he had caused. It wasn't just about wanting her back. It was about wanting to be a better person, for himself and for her, for Noah, and for the family they could have had. The process was slow, agonizingly so, but each step he took felt like a small victory. His journey toward redemption was only just beginning, but Maximilian knew that he was on the right path. It was a path fraught with uncertainty and fear, But it was also a path that held the promise of healing, both for him and for those he had hurt. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Maximilian continued to work on himself. His transformation wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, painstaking process of self-discovery and growth. He took a hard look at his life, examining the choices he had made, the mistakes he had repeated, and the pain he had caused. He didn't shy away from the truth anymore. He acknowledged the flaws in his character, the fear that had driven him to build walls around his heart, the pride that had kept him from being vulnerable with those he loved. And with each revelation, he found the strength to change, to become the man he had always wanted to be. But even as he worked toward redemption, Maximilian couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. The passage of time had created a chasm between him and Isabella, one that he wasn't sure he could bridge. He had let so much time slip by, and in that time, she had built a new life without him. A part of him feared that no matter what he did, no matter how much he changed, he would never be able to undo the hurt he had caused or reclaim what he had lost. But another part of him refused to give up, to accept that his story had to end in regret. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he could try to make the future something worth living for. Maximilian's road to redemption was long, filled with doubt and pain, but he knew that it was the only way forward. He had made his choice to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult it might be. It was a journey of self-awareness, a journey that would ultimately lead him to the realization that true success was not measured in power or wealth, but in love, forgiveness, and connection. The weight of the past would never fully disappear. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, a reminder of what had been lost. But Maximilian knew that if he was ever to find peace, if he was ever to move forward, he had to embrace the lessons of his mistakes. It was time for him to rebuild what he had destroyed, to seek redemption, and to prove that he was capable of change. It wouldn't be easy, and it might never be enough to erase the scars he had left behind, but Maximilian was ready to try. For the first time in years, he felt hope, small and fragile, but real. And that was the first step toward the future he had once thought impossible. Maximilian, feeling suffocated by the ever-increasing demands of his corporate empire, decided to seek refuge in a quieter neighborhood. The bustling world he had once thrived in had become a relentless whirlwind, and he found himself yearning for a space where he could finally breathe and reflect. The new neighborhood he chose was a far cry from the glamorous, chaotic existence he had built for himself. The streets were lined with quaint, picturesque houses, and the soft hum of life was a stark contrast to the constant hum of his business empire. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the weight of his past didn't follow him around like an unwanted shadow. Maximilian believed that perhaps in this environment, he might find the peace he had been so desperately seeking. The absence of the constant buzz of phone calls, meetings, and expectations provided him the rare opportunity to finally sit with his thoughts, to reflect on the choices he had made, and to confront the growing emptiness inside him that no amount of wealth or success could fill. As the days passed, Maximilian found himself spending more time in his new home, taking long walks through the neighborhood. The tranquility that surrounded him pushed him to think about things he had avoided for years. He had been so consumed by his ambition that he had neglected everything else, convinced that success and power were all that mattered. But now, in the quiet of his new life, those same achievements felt hollow. The luxury and material wealth that had once been his measure of success no longer brought him joy. He began to question what truly mattered in life. What was the point of it all if the people who had meant the most to him were no longer in the picture? It was a sharp contrast to the image he had built, a man defined by his corporate empire, his wealth, and his reputation. But deep inside, Maximilian knew that those things had never been enough. They had only served as a distraction, a way to numb the pain of his broken relationships and lost opportunities. His mind often drifted to Isabella and the child he had never known, and a deep sense of regret crept in. The realization that he had chosen everything else over them gnawed at him, and it became increasingly difficult to ignore the longing for a life that could have been. One afternoon, as Maximilian wandered down a familiar street, lost in his thoughts, He had an encounter that changed everything. He was taking a leisurely walk, trying to clear his mind, when he bumped into someone. The shock of the encounter hit him like a lightning bolt. There, standing before him, was Isabella. She looked different, stronger somehow, but still, unmistakably her. Her beauty had deepened, her presence commanding, and yet there was something more. She carried herself with an assurance that Maximilian hadn't seen before. The years had clearly changed her, and for a moment, he wondered how much of it was the result of the pain he had caused. But what hit him the hardest was the child beside her. Noah, his son. He had missed so much. The boy was no longer a newborn or infant, but a lively, perceptive child, a tangible reminder of everything Maximilian had forfeited when he walked away from them both. The realization crushed him. He had missed all the milestones, all the moments that he would never get back. And it was in that instant that Maximilian understood the depth of his loss. The initial conversation between Maximilian and Isabella was strained, awkward. It was as if they were two strangers trying to bridge a gap that was too wide to span with mere words. Isabella's eyes held a guardedness that he couldn't ignore. There was no warmth, no familiarity in her voice, just a cool, distant tone that cut through him. And yet, as she spoke, Maximilian could sense that beneath her composed exterior, there was a whirlwind of emotions just waiting to burst through. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to say everything he had never had the courage to say, but the words stuck in his throat. The truth was, he didn't know if he could fix what he had broken. How could he? After all the time that had passed, after all the damage he had caused, what could he possibly say to make it right? Isabella, on the other hand, seemed composed, almost distant. She acknowledged his presence, but the sharpness in her tone made it clear that there was no room for old feelings to creep back in. It was as if the past was a door she had closed long ago, one that she had no intention of opening again. Still, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that made Maximilian wonder if, just maybe, there was a chance for them to talk, to confront the past, to begin healing. As Maximilian walked away from the encounter, his mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. The brief interaction had triggered a flood of regret and longing. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his decisions in a way he couldn't escape. The guilt of abandoning Isabella, of turning his back on their family, felt unbearable. He had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, on achieving the success that others admired, that he had ignored the people who mattered most. He had failed them both. The years he had spent building his empire now seemed like a hollow pursuit. He had sacrificed love, family, and connection in the name of ambition, and the emptiness he felt now was proof of just how little all of it mattered. His thoughts kept returning to Noah, his son, who had grown up without him. Maximilian didn't even know the boy, didn't know what kind of person he was becoming. He had never been there to guide him, to love him, to be a father. And that knowledge was suffocating. The sadness of what he had lost hung over him, heavy and unyielding. Isabella, too, found herself tangled in a whirlwind of emotions after their encounter. The meeting had stirred up old feelings, anger, hurt, but also a strange curiosity. She had been prepared to move on, to put Maximilian and the past behind her. But seeing him again, seeing how much he had changed, or so it seemed, forced her to confront the emotions she had long buried. Part of her wanted to believe that he had truly transformed, that he had seen the error of his ways, but another part of her feared that this was just another manipulation, another version of the man who had abandoned her when she needed him the most. There was so much anger inside her, so much resentment, but also a part of her that couldn't help but wonder if there was any possibility of closure. She had spent so many years trying to heal, to rebuild, and now, with Maximilian back in her life, the wounds felt fresh again. It was as if he had reopened them with one brief encounter, and she wasn't sure she was ready to let him in again. Isabella's primary concern, however, was Noah. She had protected him from the truth of his father's identity, never wanting to burden him with the pain of abandonment. She had built a life for them both, one that was strong, independent, and full of love, but Noah had grown up without a father, and Isabella wasn't sure if it was worth disrupting that stability now. The thought of introducing Maximilian into Noah's life made her uneasy. She didn't want to risk hurting her son, especially if Maximilian wasn't truly committed to being a father. There was so much at stake, and Isabella knew that if she allowed him back in, it would be a decision that would affect not only her but her son as well. The complexity of the situation weighed heavily on her, and she struggled to figure out what to do. Could she forgive him? Could she allow him back into her life? Knowing what he had done, could she trust him again? These were questions she wasn't ready to answer, but the pull of old emotions made them impossible to ignore. Maximilian, on the other hand, was consumed by the reality that the past could never be undone. His yearning for a second chance with Isabella was met with the harsh truth that it might never happen. He had failed her, and he had failed their family. Even if he had changed, could she ever see him in the same light again? His heart longed for redemption, for a chance to make amends, but the fear of rejection was paralyzing. The distance between them seemed insurmountable, and Maximilian had to confront the possibility that, despite his regrets and his desire for change, he might never be able to fix what was broken. Isabella, in her quiet moments, found herself torn between two conflicting desires. On one hand, she wanted to protect herself, her life, and most importantly, Noah, from the pain that Maximilian's return might bring. She had built a world without him, a world where she and her son were enough. Her life was not perfect, but it was hers, and she was proud of what she had created. The wounds of the past were still tender, and the idea of reopening them felt like a betrayal to everything she had fought for. She had learned to live without Maximilian, to rely on herself, and she feared that letting him back into her life, even in a small way, might unravel everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. But on the other hand, she couldn't deny the pull of the past, the lingering emotions that she had never truly dealt with. Part of her wondered if they could find closure, if they could find peace, and if perhaps there was some small sliver of forgiveness that could lead them both to healing. The decision was not an easy one. Isabella spent days reflecting on what was best for Noah, what was best for her, and what was best for their future. She knew she couldn't let Maximilian back into her life without careful consideration. She didn't want to risk damaging Noah's perception of the world, and she certainly didn't want to expose him to more heartache. But she also knew that in order to truly move forward, she needed to face the past, even if it meant confronting the man who had caused her so much pain. Could she allow him to be a part of their lives again? Or was it too late for any kind of reconciliation? Maximilian, for his part, struggled with his own internal battles. The more he reflected on the years he had spent running from his past, the more he realized just how much he had missed. He had buried himself in work, in the pursuit of power and wealth, but none of it had brought him the fulfillment he had hoped for. His success had always been a distraction, a way to avoid confronting the true cost of his choices. Now, facing Isabella again, seeing the life she had built without him, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to repair what had been broken. The realization that he may never be a part of Noah's life was a blow he hadn't anticipated, and it only deepened his regret. Yet, he knew that the road to redemption would not be an easy one. Even if Isabella were willing to listen, even if she were open to some form of reconciliation, there was no guarantee that it would lead to anything meaningful. Maximilian knew that actions spoke louder than words, and the years he had spent neglecting his responsibilities weighed heavily on him. One day, after much contemplation, Isabella made a decision. She could no longer allow her past with Maximilian to dictate her future. She had been given a second chance at life, at happiness, and she refused to let anyone take that away from her, not even him. She had learned that she was strong enough to survive without him, and she would continue to build a life for herself and Noah, one step at a time. The pain of the past would always be there, a scar that would never fully heal, but she was no longer afraid of it. She was ready to take control of her life, to set boundaries that protected her heart and her family. Maximilian, she decided, would not be a part of their lives unless he proved that he could be someone worthy of their trust and love. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about taking back the power she had once given away. And so, with a quiet resolve, Isabella made her choice. She would not chase after closure. She would not allow Maximilian to disrupt the life she had fought so hard to create. If he wanted to be a part of their world, he would have to prove it to her. But she would no longer be the one to seek him out. She would not allow herself to be pulled back into the past, not for the sake of nostalgia, and certainly not for the sake of someone who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Maximilian, on the other hand, was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. His heart ached as he realized that, despite his yearning for redemption, it might be too late. Isabella had moved on, built a life without him, and he couldn't expect her to simply welcome him back into it. Still, a part of him refused to give up. He had made his mistakes, yes, but he wasn't ready to let go of the possibility of making things right. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he also knew that he had to try. He couldn't live with the regret of not trying. In the days that followed, Maximilian worked tirelessly to prove to himself and to Isabella that he had changed. He began by confronting the emptiness inside him, the part of himself he had long ignored. He sought therapy, delved into introspection, and began to unravel the layers of his own heartache. It was not an easy journey, and there were moments when he wanted to give up, when the weight of his own guilt felt too much to bear. But he pushed through, determined to understand himself before he could expect anyone else to understand him. Slowly, he began to change, piece by piece, action by action. He made an effort to reach out to those he had pushed away, to mend the broken relationships in his life. Meanwhile, Isabella continued to live her life, her art evolving with every stroke of the brush. She had learned that healing was not linear, and that even on the days when the pain felt overwhelming, she had the strength to carry on. She had found peace in her work, in her love for Noah, and in the quiet moments of reflection that allowed her to grow. She didn't need Maximilian to define her happiness, but she couldn't deny the ache of what might have been. As the months went by, their paths would cross again, in small ways, and each time, they would take one step closer to understanding each other, perhaps not as lovers, but as two people who had been irrevocably changed by the choices they had made. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. The journey of healing was far from over. Maximilian knew that his past actions could never be undone, but he was determined to try. His first steps toward reconciliation were clumsy, filled with hesitation and awkwardness, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in his voice. He had lived with the burden of regret for so long that the idea of approaching Isabella felt both terrifying and necessary. The words he spoke were raw, confessing the truth of his departure, the fear, the pride, the cowardice that had pushed him away. He told her how deeply he regretted leaving her alone and pregnant, how much he had suffered knowing that he had abandoned not just her, but their future together. His confession was filled with the weight of years of regret. Yet it was clear that no amount of verbal apology could erase the pain he had caused. Still, Maximilian was willing to face the consequences of his actions, hoping that perhaps his efforts would show Isabella that he was no longer the same man who had walked away all those years ago. However, Isabella's response was not what he had hoped for. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, everything came rushing back in that moment. Her heart, scarred from years of abandonment, felt as though it was being torn open again. While she heard his apology, it did little to soothe the ache that had festered over time. The words, though genuine, seemed distant, as though they could not possibly match the depth of the wound he had inflicted. She saw the man before her, the one who had changed, but it didn't change the fact that he had been the one to leave her, to leave their family behind. Her instincts, protective and cautious, rose to the surface, making it impossible for her to simply forgive him, to let the past slip away as though it hadn't left a permanent mark. She wanted to believe that he had changed, but the scars were still fresh, and the weight of their shared history prevented her from offering him any grace. She needed time, distance, and space to process everything. But for now, the wall she had built around her heart remained firm, no matter how much she might have longed for something different. Maximilian could see the resistance in Isabella's eyes, the wall she had erected in the years of their separation. He understood that no amount of words could undo the damage he had done. His heart ached as he watched her, knowing that the pain of their past was a barrier he would have to overcome. He understood now, more than ever, that actions spoke louder than words, and it was through his actions, not his apologies, that he would have to prove his sincerity. He began small, thoughtful gestures, helping her with a community art project that she was passionate about. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way for him to show that he wasn't just apologizing, but he was trying to contribute, to make up for the years of absence. He didn't expect forgiveness overnight. He simply wanted to be present, to show her that he valued her work, her vision, and the woman she had become in his absence. The project was more than just an opportunity for him to make amends. It was a chance for Isabella to witness his vulnerability in ways that words could never capture. Through his genuine involvement, she began to see glimpses of the man he had become, self-aware, humble, and dedicated to making right the wrongs he had committed. Still, Isabella was cautious, her heart torn between the man he was now and the man he had been. Her trust, built so carefully over the years, was fragile, and even the smallest crack in it could break everything. Yet, in the quiet moments of collaboration, she found herself softening, ever so slightly, as she began to see a side of Maximilian that reflected his growth. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was enough to spark the faintest glimmer of hope. The emotional battle inside Isabella only deepened as she struggled to reconcile her past love for Maximilian with the wounds he had inflicted. She was torn between the remnants of the affection she once had for him, a love that had been real and deep, and the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. She could see the changes in him, the genuine efforts, the humility, the vulnerability, but could she trust that this was the man he had truly become? Could she risk letting him back into her life, into Noah's life, when so much of her heart had been broken by him? She thought about Noah, about how her son had never known the love of his father, how he had grown up without that connection. Could she open that door, knowing how fragile it was, knowing that letting Maximilian into their lives could either bring healing or heartbreak? Her heart was torn in two, and every decision seemed like a gamble with her emotional well-being. But as she watched him, his quiet sincerity, his willingness to sacrifice for her and their community, she found herself questioning everything she had once believed about forgiveness and healing. Could she forgive him? Could she let go of the past? Or would the scars always be there, holding her back from ever truly moving forward? Maximilian, for his part, understood that his efforts could not be rushed. He knew that he had done irreparable damage in the past, but the more time he spent with Isabella, the more he realized that the journey toward redemption would be long and uncertain. His apologies, his actions, they were just the beginning. He had to prove himself, not only to Isabella but also to himself, that he was truly committed to change. There were moments when the weight of his own regret seemed unbearable, moments when he feared that the years of absence would be too much to overcome. But he continued, driven by the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could be the man that Isabella and Noah deserved. The more vulnerable he became, the more he admitted the depth of his mistakes, especially when it came to his failure as a father. He knew he had lost precious time, and the pain of that loss was something he would never be able to undo. Yet he couldn't help but believe that there was still a chance, however small, to rebuild the connections he had once taken for granted. His actions, his involvement in the art project, his attempts to support her without asking for anything in return, were all part of that journey. He hoped that by showing her the man he had become, rather than just telling her, he might finally earn the forgiveness he so desperately sought. Isabella's internal battle raged on, each moment bringing her closer to a decision, yet further from any real certainty. The pain of the past was always there, lingering just beneath the surface, a constant reminder of what had been taken from her. As she watched Maximilian work alongside her on the community art project, she couldn't deny that there was something different about him now, something more humble, more genuine. His involvement wasn't just about making amends. It was about showing her that he was willing to be there for her in ways he hadn't been before. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability in his every action, and part of her wanted to believe that this was the man he had always been capable of becoming. But another part of her was afraid of opening herself up to him again, of allowing the pain of the past to resurface, of trusting him only to be hurt once more. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her struggle wasn't just about forgiving Maximilian. It was about forgiving herself. She had spent so many years protecting her heart, shielding herself from the pain he had caused, that she had forgotten how to open herself up to the possibility of love and healing. She had built a life for herself, one that didn't depend on anyone else. She had become a mother to Noah, a strong, independent woman who had learned to live without the man she once loved. And yet, despite all her strength, there was a part of her that still longed for the connection she had lost. Was it wrong to want that again? Was it wrong to wonder if, just maybe, forgiveness could open the door to something new, something that could bring her peace and healing? She had no answers, only questions, and the weight of those questions pressed heavily on her heart. As days passed, Isabella began to soften, though her guard remained up. There were moments when she allowed herself to feel the warmth of Maximilian's presence, when she found herself laughing at something he said, or when she noticed the genuine care he took in supporting her. Those moments, fleeting as they were, made her wonder if forgiveness was possible. Yet, she couldn't help but remember the pain, the devastation, the loneliness she had endured after he left. The years of rebuilding her life, of healing, of becoming the woman she was now. Could she risk all of that for a man who had once abandoned her and their child? Could she ever truly trust him again, even with his newfound vulnerability? Maximilian, on his part, was beginning to understand the magnitude of the struggle he had placed on Isabella's shoulders. He knew that no matter how many acts of kindness he performed, no matter how much he apologized, the damage had already been done. It was not enough to say the words. He had to prove them with every action, with every breath. His regret weighed heavily on him, especially as he looked at Noah, who had grown up without the father he so desperately needed. Maximilian had missed so much, so many milestones, so many precious moments, and the pain of that loss was a constant companion. But he also knew that there was no going back. The only way forward was through humility, through understanding that forgiveness could not be earned overnight, and that every step he took would have to be taken with patience and genuine love. In quiet moments, when the art project was on pause, or when the conversations between them were minimal, Maximilian found himself wondering if Isabella could ever truly forgive him, if they could ever rebuild what they once had. His heart ached with the fear that the years of absence, the mistakes he had made, might be too much to overcome. But he also knew that he had to try, that he couldn't let his past define his future. He couldn't live with the regret of not making an effort, of not showing Isabella the man he had become. As Isabella grappled with her emotions, the idea of forgiveness began to take root, albeit slowly and with great caution. She started to see that forgiving Maximilian didn't mean forgetting the past or erasing the hurt. It meant releasing herself from the chains of anger and resentment that had held her hostage for so long. It meant giving herself permission to move forward, not for him, but for her own healing. She had carried the weight of his betrayal for years, and while it was a part of her story, it didn't have to define her future. The decision wasn't easy. It wasn't a moment of clarity that wiped away the years of pain, but rather a gradual realization that she had the power to choose her path, to decide whether to carry the weight of the past with her or to set it down and step into something new. Maximilian's continued presence, his continued efforts, were not lost on her. She could see the depth of his sincerity, and though it wasn't enough to erase the pain, it was enough to begin to mend the cracks in her heart. Forgiveness would take time, it would require patience, and it would never be without its struggles. But the possibility of a future without the weight of unresolved anger began to feel more attainable. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about allowing herself the chance to heal, to find peace, and perhaps, just perhaps, to let Maximilian back in her life in a way that was healthier, more conscious, and rooted in mutual respect and understanding. As the days passed, Isabella and Maximilian moved slowly toward a place of understanding, though neither knew for certain what the future would hold. They both knew that their journey was far from over, that there was still much to work through, and that forgiveness, if it came, would be a process, not a moment. But the small steps they to Maximilian's internal struggle continued to intensify as the days turned into weeks. And despite the small steps he had taken toward reconciliation, he could feel the weight of his past mistakes bearing down on him. He knew that he couldn't expect Isabella to forgive him easily, nor could he expect her to just let go of the hurt he had caused. But each time he saw her, each time she allowed him to help, to be part of her world in some small way, he felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, but it was there, and he clung to it like a lifeline. His growing vulnerability was a reflection of his desperate desire to make things right, to prove that he wasn't the man who had abandoned her all those years ago. He had spent too long hiding behind his wealth, behind the corporate empire he had built, and now he realized that none of it meant anything without the people who truly mattered, without Isabella, without Noah. Maximilian's efforts to show Isabella the depth of his regret continued in quiet, subtle ways. He didn't seek grand gestures or expect immediate results, but he remained present, slowly earning back her trust through consistent actions. One afternoon, as they worked side by side on her art project, she asked for his opinion on a particular piece she had been struggling with. It wasn't much, a simple request, but for Maximilian, it felt like a breakthrough. It was a moment where she allowed him to be part of her creative process, where she trusted him enough to let him into a space that had been hers alone for so long. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was progress, and Maximilian clung to it, cherishing the moment as a sign that there was still hope for them. Isabella, too, began to notice the subtle changes in her own heart. While she had once been so determined to protect herself, to shield her heart from any further pain, she now found herself questioning whether holding on to the past was the best way to move forward. The anger that had once been all-consuming began to lose its grip on her, replaced by a quiet understanding that forgiveness, if she chose to give it, was more for her than for him. She had spent so many years consumed by the hurt he had caused, by the abandonment, that she had never fully allowed herself to heal. Letting go of that anger didn't mean forgetting what had happened, but it did mean accepting that her life had moved on, that she had created a new world for herself and Noah. The idea of letting Maximilian back into that world was still terrifying, but it no longer felt impossible. The door to forgiveness was cracked open, even if just a little, and she wasn't sure what lay beyond it. Noah, too, played a significant role in Isabella's emotional journey. She had always been protective of him, careful not to expose him to the potential pain of Maximilian's absence. She had raised him alone, and while Noah had never known his father, Isabella had worked hard to make sure he never felt the void left by Maximilian's departure. But as Maximilian continued to show up in small ways, as he helped with her art project and spent time with them, Noah began to notice the shift. He wasn't entirely sure what was happening, but he could sense the change in the air. He could see the way his mother looked at Maximilian with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He could hear the conversations between them, the tentative moments where they shared more than just pleasantries. And though he never asked outright, he seemed to sense that there was more to the story than what he had been told. He didn't yet know who Maximilian was to him, but the fact that he was there at all, that he was trying, made a difference. For the first time in years, Isabella felt that she was navigating this path, not just for herself, but for Noah as well. As the days turned into months, the emotional distance between Isabella and Maximilian continued to shrink, but it was clear that the path to full forgiveness and healing would take time. There were still moments of tension, moments when the past seemed too painful to confront. But with every small step forward, they both grew more confident in the possibility of reconciliation. Maximilian knew that he could not rush her into forgiveness, that it had to come when she was ready, when she had processed the depth of her emotions. He could only continue to prove himself through his actions, through his unwavering commitment to being present, to being the man she needed him to be. Not the man he once was, but the man he had become. Isabella, for her part, remained cautious, but she no longer felt as trapped by her anger. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the past. It was about freeing herself from the emotional chains that had bound her for so long. She had built a life that she was proud of, a life that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or love. But the possibility of a future where she didn't have to carry the weight of resentment, where she could open herself to the possibility of love again, whether with Maximilian or on her own, felt like a gift she could give herself. The journey wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was hers to navigate one step at a time. In the end, the struggle for forgiveness wasn't a singular moment of resolution, but a gradual, ongoing process. It was an internal battle that neither Maximilian nor Isabella could avoid, a journey they both had to take at their own pace. There was no certainty in the future, no guarantee that everything would work out as they both hoped. But what they did know was that the door to healing was open, and that was enough for now. For Maximilian, the weight of his regrets would never fully lift, but the knowledge that he was working toward redemption, toward being a better man, a better father, a better partner, gave him the strength to continue. For Isabella, the choice to forgive was still a question she had yet to answer fully, but the possibility of reconciliation, of healing, was now within reach. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they both felt that they were no longer walking alone. Isabella sat quietly one evening, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment of clarity. The emotional weight she had carried for so long, the anger, the pain, the betrayal, had slowly begun to lighten, piece by piece. She realized that her decision to forgive Maximilian wasn't just about him or his repeated apologies. It was a decision for herself, a choice to free herself from the bitterness and resentment that had clung to her for years. She no longer wanted to be bound by the past, no longer wanted to let it control her every thought and decision. Forgiveness, she understood now, was not about erasing what had happened. It was about making space for something new, for healing, for growth. It was about letting go of the chains of old wounds and embracing the possibility of a future where she could move forward without the weight of anger dragging her down. Though her forgiveness was quiet, unspoken at first, it was clear in her actions. The way she smiled at Maximilian now, the way she let him help with the smallest tasks, the way she no longer flinched when he was near. Each moment was a sign that she was ready to let go and start again. Her heart, once closed off, was now opening slowly, cautiously but steadily. She was ready for a new chapter, a new beginning. Their relationship, though still fragile, began to evolve in small but significant ways. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't always smooth, but there were moments, shared glances, quiet conversations, and unspoken understanding that began to rebuild the trust they once had. Trust, after all, was something that could not be rebuilt overnight. It had to be earned, piece by piece, through consistent actions and time. Isabella didn't expect perfection, and neither did Maximilian. He knew that regaining her trust would take time, but he was willing to wait, to prove that he was no longer the man who had hurt her all those years ago. He proved this through his patience, through his small gestures of kindness, and through his unwavering dedication to earning her trust once again. As they navigated these delicate steps, there was a growing sense of affection between them, grounded in mutual respect and understanding. They both knew that their relationship would never be the same as it once was, but they were okay with that. The past had shaped them, but it didn't have to define their future. Maximilian's most challenging test, however, was yet to come: his relationship with Noah. Meeting his son, the child he had abandoned, was a daunting prospect. He understood that Noah's trust could not be demanded or rushed. It had to be earned, just as Isabella's had. Initially, Noah was distant, unsure of how to react to the man who had been absent from his life. Maximilian, though eager to reconnect, understood the importance of patience. He respected Noah's boundaries, never pushing him, but instead showing, through small acts of kindness, that he wanted to be part of his life. At first, Noah kept his emotional walls high, unsure of whether he could ever accept Maximilian into his world. But slowly, over time, things began to shift. Maximilian took the time to find common ground with Noah, shared interests, moments of quiet conversation, simple acts of kindness, and gradually, Noah began to soften. It wasn't an overnight transformation, and there were still moments of tension, but a bond began to form. It was tentative at first, but with each small breakthrough, the walls between them began to crumble. Maximilian knew that rebuilding his relationship with Noah would take time, but he was committed to proving that he could be a loving, present father, a figure Noah could depend on. And slowly, Noah started to trust him, to see the man Maximilian had become. As their relationship with Noah grew stronger, so did their family dynamic. Isabella and Maximilian worked together, as partners, to create a new family unit. It wasn't without its struggles, but they navigated them with patience and understanding. They learned how to co-parent and how to blend their family in a way that honored the past but focused on the future. Maximilian, once so focused on his career and power, began to realize that his true worth was not found in the boardrooms or the accolades of business success. His wealth, his status, none of it meant anything without the love and connection of his family. He made the monumental decision to step down from his position as CEO, prioritizing his role as a father, a partner, and a man who had learned to value emotional connection over material gain. It was a profound shift, one that reflected the depth of his transformation. Maximilian was no longer the man driven by pride, fear, or ambition. He was a man who understood the importance of love, family, and the vulnerability that came with both. Maximilian's redemption was solidified through his actions. He didn't just say he had changed. He proved it, day by day, through his commitment to being a present, supportive partner and father. His growth was evident not only in his relationship with Isabella, but in his relationship with Noah as well. He was no longer the self-absorbed man he once was. He had become someone who understood the true meaning of family and connection, someone who sought to build relationships founded on trust, empathy, and love. His redemption was not about perfection. It was about the willingness to change, to acknowledge past mistakes, and to work tirelessly to make things right. For Isabella, this transformation wasn't just about Maximilian. It was about her own growth as well. As she prepared for her new art exhibition, one that symbolized her own personal and artistic rebirth, she reflected on the journey she had taken. Her work, once filled with pain and sorrow, now reflected the growth, healing, and love that surrounded her. Maximilian, in his new role, played a pivotal part in this exhibition, helping to bring her vision to life. It wasn't just an art show. It was a celebration of everything they had been through, everything they had overcome, and everything they had yet to build together. The exhibition was a public declaration of their new beginning, a symbol of the strength of their love and the emotional journey they had shared. As they stood together, Maximilian, Isabella, and Noah, they looked toward the future, not with fear, but with hope. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined them. What defined them now was the love they had rebuilt, the trust they had earned, and the commitment they had made to one another. The future was no longer a source of anxiety, but a promise that they could face whatever challenges came their way together. And so, as Isabella's art exhibition came to a close, the family embraced the future with open hearts, knowing that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, they faced it not as individuals, but as a united family, ready to embrace whatever blessings and challenges lay ahead. With a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper commitment to one another, and a profound understanding of the importance of love and family, they were ready to face the future together.